In this video, I will show you how to create an AI image animation that Iman used in one of his videos. I'll take you through the entire process step by step, all the way from generating the images to bringing them to life with animation. Every asset I used is linked in the description below, so you can easily follow along. Now let's get to work. Let's get into ChatGPT first and generate the AI image. We're gonna have to write it a prompt and explain how we want our scene to look like. So I basically told him to generate me a dramatic scene with blue lighting, featuring two figures engaging in a chess game with a cinematic atmosphere. And when I press generate, this is what I ended up with. It's not exactly what I want, so I'm gonna give it a few more prompts to make sure that we get the exact image that we want. And with this, it's basically trial and error. Sometimes you're gonna get exactly what you want straight away, but sometimes you're gonna have to write more prompts to get a desired image. And also a quick reminder is that you don't have to use ChatGPT. I use it simply because it has always done a good job for me, but you can also use tools like Midjourney, Leonardo AI, Adobe Firefly, or any else AI program that you know. Also, for all of you that are not able to get a hold of any AI software, I'm gonna leave all the assets I used as well as the generated AI image in the description so you can download it and practice for free. And at the end, this is the picture that I ended up with and that I'm gonna be using throughout the video. So let's download it by clicking this button. And now before we get into After Effects and actually start animating the picture, we're first gonna have to separate its foreground and background elements. To do it, we're gonna use Photoshop. So I simply open Photoshop and drag the image into it, and this is now the starting point. So the main thing we're using Photoshop for is to separate these people along with this chessboard and this elevated surface from everything else that we can see in this image. Okay, so first make sure to click on this lock icon. That's gonna make sure the layer gets unlocked, and now we can work with it. The tool I like to use while dealing with AI pictures is the object selection tool, because it uses AI to find objects in the scene and it makes our job of masking things a lot easier. So let's start by selecting this guy. Now make sure to hold shift to select this chessboard, and also keep holding shift while selecting this guy right here. Now I'd also like to select these stairs right here, but for some reason we can see that AI is not selecting what we want to, so we're gonna have to do it manually. But there's also one very good option that you can use, and that is the lasso tool up here. And again, make sure you're holding shift and then just simply draw a shape around the object. And now we can see that it did a pretty good job, but we still got left with a few spots that we have to select. So hold shift again, select the area, and now we can see that it's been selected. And now do the same thing for this one. And now I'm really happy with how it looks, so we're gonna click on this mask tool right here. Now we have the foreground separated from the background, but the problem is that we lost the background and we don't want that. So let's select this layer and copy it with Ctrl J, and on this one we can delete the layer mask. That way when we hide this layer, we're gonna have the foreground separated from its background. But the problem is, if we hide the foreground, we still got left with the original image, and that's not going to work. So let's place this one above, double click and call it foreground, and I'll simply hold Ctrl or Command and set this layer mask. That is gonna make sure the selection around the foreground is visible. And now let's select this layer down here, go up here to select, hit modify, expand, and expand the selection by approximately 15 to 20 pixels. Hit OK, and now we're gonna see this. Hit generative fill and simply click on generate. At first, it seems like nothing has changed, but if we now hide the foreground layer, we're gonna notice that the background has been filled out pretty well. And now we can select these two layers, right click, and merge layers. Let's call this one background. And here we can see that we have now separated the background from its foreground. Now we can simply go to File, Save As, and simply save this Photoshop file anywhere on our computer. The reason we don't have to save it as a JPEG or PNG file is because After Effects recognizes PSD files, so we don't have to mess around with any of that. We can just save the Photoshop file and import it straight into After Effects. And now that we are inside After Effects, we can just drag and drop our Photoshop file, make sure it's set to composition retain layer sizes, and the layer option is set to editable layer styles. Click OK, and now drag this cinematic chess composition in the timeline. We can open the composition, copy these two, and paste them here, and we can now delete the composition. Here we can see what we're left with. Those are the same two layers that we had in Photoshop, but we have now imported them inside After Effects. So now you can simply do whatever you like in terms of design. Before we do anything, let's make sure these layers are 3D, and now you can, for example, scale this one. And the whole point of separating the layers would actually be to make sure there's a clear length gap between the two. So we're gonna place this foreground layer a lot further apart from the background. And now you can use the scale option to scale this one to where it was before. And now if this thing is good enough for you, you can proceed. You can basically do anything that you like and anything that you find that looks appealing to you. What I'm gonna do is basically rearrange the whole image. I'm gonna press S for scale on the background layer. I'm gonna make sure it's scaled in a lot more. And now I'm gonna take the foreground layer and scale it up too. You simply have to play around with its values until you're happy with the result. And now that I'm happy with how they're positioned, I wanna show it how it looks like from a different perspective. I'm gonna click here and set it to 2 views, and now we can see how our background element is clearly set back from its foreground part, which is exactly what we need in creating these images because it gives image depth and makes it look much more natural and realistic. Okay, so now we can go back to our regular view. It kind of looks like the point of view of the whole scene is set from the ground up, like we're looking at the image from the ground angle, and I don't want that. I want it to be aligned with the eye or body level. So I'm gonna make sure to select both foreground and background, press R for rotation, and now select X rotation on both by holding Control. Now shift it a little, and this is what I'm happy with, so I'm gonna stick to this. Let's now deal with the rest of the elements. First, we're gonna create a circle. Just hold the left mouse button on this rectangle tool, choose the ellipse tool, draw a circle by holding Shift. Here we can adjust its color a little. Then let's import these two men avatar icons. Let's scale them down a little. Now we're gonna position them inside a circle like this. We're gonna have to flip them, so right click the image, transform, flip horizontal. And now to make them white, we can just use the fill effect, drag it onto the layer. Now choose the color white. To mask this circle, we're gonna have to pre-compose it. So hit Ctrl, Shift, and C. We can name that circle. Now hit the pen tool and mask out the desired part of the shape like this. Now simply hit M on your keyboard for mask. Select inverted. Now hit F on the keyboard for mask feather and increase that value a little. That's gonna create this feather around the mask so it's not so sharp. The only thing left to do now is to write some text. So select the type tool, click on the screen. Once we're done writing the text, let's scale it down a little. Now double click on the text. I'm using the Helvetica font. It is now set to bold, but I'm gonna switch to this option right here. That's gonna make it bold and italic. To create a dashed line, we're gonna have to click on the pen tool again. Make sure nothing down here is selected so we don't create a mask. Now click anywhere and then click for the second point. And now we can drag it to create a curved shape. Once we're happy with how it looks, we can just let off the mouse button. Now select it and click here to change its color. And now to create the dashes, we're gonna have to go into the line properties, go to contents, shape, stroke, and then hit this plus icon next to the dashes. We can now play with this slider to set how many dashes we want to have. I'm gonna leave it like this. I'll just make sure the dashes are a bit thinner. Now I'd like to stylize these layers a little and animate them. So first, let's pre-compose this circle and the icons. Right click, pre-compose. We can call it icons plus circle. To animate it, we're simply gonna have to click on it, press T for opacity, keyframe opacity, push it a little forward, and now set it to 0. Select the keyframes, press F9 to easy ease. Make sure the motion blur is selected, and now when we play the clip, we're gonna see it fade in. To animate the text, we're gonna select it first, go to the Effects and Presets tab, open Animation Presets, text, and then open animate in, and then choose the effect slide up by word. Drag it onto the text layer, press U to see all the active keyframes, and now when we play the video, we're gonna see the text sliding up by word. But I don't like the fact that it's coming from a really far distance, so I'm gonna open text here, range selector, and then change this position value to something like 100, and now it's gonna look much better. The last thing left to animate is this line right here, so we're gonna click on this arrow, click on add, and choose trim paths. Open up trim paths, set a keyframe on this end option, go a bit back, and put it to 0%. You can now select it in easy ease, turn motion blur on, select the keyframes, go to the graph, tweak it up a little, and then once we play the video, we're gonna have everything animated. Now to fully sell the effect, I'd add deep glow to each element. So I'm gonna search for deep glow in this menu and add it to every element. I'm gonna make sure it's much less visible by lowering the exposure, and I think this looks fine, so I'm gonna leave it at this. Now I'm gonna copy it off to every other layer, and this is how it looks. Now we can also add drop shadow to each of these elements to make it stand out more from the background, but you have to make sure that you place this drop shadow above the deep glow. And now we're simply gonna have to repeat the same thing but on the other side. Once we have repeated the same thing on the other side, we can now start stylizing the video. But before we do anything, let's make sure every layer is 3D. We're gonna do it by selecting them and then hitting this 3D icon. And we can now notice that everything got fucked up. So we're just gonna press P for position and then position these layers so that they're in front of the background. Something like this is fine. It would be a lot better if these lines, text, and icons right here were at the Z value of this foreground element. If I decided to move them right now, it would all look weird. So I'm not gonna do that now, but this is a really good reminder to you all that you should always make your layers 3D before doing everything else. But since this is a simple camera movement we're gonna be creating, it's not really gonna be noticeable, so that's fine. Now let's press right click and add an adjustment layer. An adjustment layer is basically a layer that affects every other layer that is below it. So instead of having to put all the effects on each layer, we can just add an adjustment layer above it, and it will then be applied to every layer that is under the adjustment layer. So I'm gonna add a tint effect, and I'll map the white color to blue, something like this. Press OK, and now I'm gonna blend it in with the original image. I only want to apply these effects to the foreground and the background element, so I'm gonna move this adjustment layer so it's right above them. And I think something like this looks a lot better. Now I'm gonna add another adjustment layer, and effects that I'm gonna put on this layer are gonna be applied to every layer in the timeline. I'm gonna add noise to it. I'll leave it at about 8%, and I think adding vignette to it would make it look a lot better. So this is how it looked like before we applied these effects, and this is what it looks like now. The only thing left to do now is to add a camera, animate the zoom in, and that's it. So press right click, new camera, make sure it's one node and the preset is set to 50, click OK, and now simply press P for position, set a keyframe, go further, and now just zoom in a little. There's one thing that I forgot to do, and that is animating these characters. We're gonna do that with this puppet pin tool, so make sure the foreground layer is selected, click on the puppet tool, and it also would have been better if I had separated these guys from the foreground layer, but it's not gonna make any difference anyway because we're gonna put enough pins here so everything else remains stationary. I'm just quickly gonna turn off the adjustment layer so it doesn't lag so much, and now we can start placing the pins. Make sure you place enough pins so that everything you don't want to move remains stationary, and the pin that you want to move around could be moved without any problems. So now simply select the foreground layer and press U. Here we're gonna see all of these puppet pins. Now we have to identify the one that we want to move. So I want to move this top one, so I'm gonna select it, and here we're gonna see that the puppet pin 1 got selected, which means this is the pin we want to keyframe. So let's go a bit further, change up this value a bit, now go further again, and then simply bring the value a bit back, and then you can simply copy these two, go further, place it, and I'll do it over and over again. When we're done with the movement, we can select these pins, hit F9, that's gonna make the motion a lot smoother, and on top of everything we can add motion blur. So now we have this guy animated, and we simply have to repeat the same thing for the guy on the right side. Now we can turn these adjustment layers back on, and at the end we're gonna add the effect called posterize time to our adjustment layer. Let's set the frame rate to about 16, and with a few final touches your scene should look something like this. Don't forget, all the assets I used are linked in the description below. Let me know in the comments if this tutorial helped you or what you'd like me to cover next. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.